All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a really close look at Illumina, Inc.,
Illumina,
a
yeah.
company that, well, if you're interested in genomic sequencing technology, it's a name you know.
Mhm.
And we've got a ton of information to go through with you all today. We've got company reports, market analyses, we've got the latest news, and we're going to try to pull out the most important insights. We'll explore what Illumina really does, how their leadership looks, their financial health, their place in the market, and where they might be headed in the future. So consider this your deep dive into understanding this major player in the world of biotech.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just skimming the surface here. No,
Yeah.
no, no. We want to give you a really a thorough understanding of Illumina, looking at the core of what drives their business and the big challenges they're facing right now.
So let's jump right into it. Chapter 1, business understanding. So what does Illumina do? Well, at their core, they're developing and selling these integrated systems.
Yeah.
And these systems, they allow scientists and doctors to read and understand the genetic code. It's like technology for analyzing genetic variation in biological function.
Right. And their business model, it's actually pretty smart. They've got this two-pronged approach. On one hand, they sell the actual instruments themselves, the sequencing machines, the microarray scanners, things like that. But then, maybe even more importantly, there's this recurring revenue stream they get from consumables, like, reagents and flow cells.
Yeah, yeah.
The stuff customers need to buy over and over again to keep those instruments running. It's like that old razor and blades model, right? Like you buy a printer and the printer itself might be, affordable, but then you got to keep buying those ink cartridges, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great analogy. You make that big investment in a high-end system like, their NovaSec X series or Next X series, and then bam, you're constantly needing to buy their specialized kits and chemicals. And of course, they're not just selling hardware, they're also generating revenue through software licenses and subscriptions for their, bioinformatics platforms like
Yes.
their Dragon Bio IT and Base Space. And they offer direct sequencing services, and instrument support. They've really built a whole ecosystem around this.
Yeah, and this diversification moving into software and services, those have higher profit margins. So it really gives them stability, right? More growth potential, not just relying on instrument sales.
Totally. Now, what's really impressive is their global reach. We're talking over 155 to 160 countries. That's huge. And they had, historically at least, a really big installed base.
Yeah.
Over 21,000 instruments as of 2022 and 2023.
Right.
Think about that. It's a huge network of labs all over the world, all using Illumina technology. And then you've got over 9,250 employees as of last year. Their operational capacity is, well, it's pretty significant.
Absolutely. It really shows you just how dominant they are in this market. And, their core value, the thing they really push is empowering researchers and clinicians to use the genome to improve human health. They provide the tools, the accuracy, the speed, the high throughput for genetic analysis.
Yeah, totally.
Mhm.
And if we look at the bigger picture here, Illumina has played a big part in making this kind of information, genomic information, more accessible. By continually innovating and driving down the cost of sequencing, they've allowed a much wider range of labs and institutions to do this kind of research. It's kind of democratized it in a way.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, so let's move on to Chapter 2, Management Evaluation. We know what Illumina does. Now let's look at who's running the show, right?
Right.
Who's steering this ship. So, since September 2023, the CEO has been Jacob Thaysen. He has a PhD, and he brought with him a lot of experience from Agile Technologies. He's in senior leadership there, responsible for a lot of revenue generation. And it's interesting because under his leadership, Illumina actually exceeded Q4 2024 revenue expectations. Then we've got CFO Ankur Dhingra and CTO Steve Barnard. Steve's actually been with the company for quite a while.
Right. And, I always think it's really telling to look at how a company's handled tough times, right? Like crisis moments. And Illumina has a pretty interesting history there. During the COVID-19 pandemic, their technology was really important. I mean, they were instrumental in sequencing SARS-CoV-2 really quickly. And that was huge for vaccine development. Remember the Shanghai Public Health Clinical Center? They were using Illumina's NovaSec 6000 system.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually got the first FDA emergency use authorization for a sequencing-based COVID-19 diagnostic. It's It's pretty amazing how fast they were able to deploy their technology in a situation like that. You know, what does that tell us about their agility, like how they adapt, how reliable their systems are under pressure?
Yeah, totally. And it's not just the pandemic. The sources we looked at also mentioned how they recovered after the 2008 financial crisis and how they used their iSeq system during the Ebola outbreak. That shows you there's a certain level of resilience built into this organization. They can adapt, they can bounce back.
Exactly. And transparency is so important, right? Especially when you're talking about investor confidence. And it seems like Illumina gets that. They've got an active investor relations team. They do their earnings calls, their press releases, they file everything with the SEC. And there's actually a recent job posting for a VP of investor relations, so it seems like they're really focused on this area.
Yeah, I think that's a good sign. And another thing that stood out to me was their commitment to ethical practices. They've got a pretty comprehensive code of conduct. They have an ethics advisory board, which is, independent with experts from outside the company. And they even have a supplier code of conduct. It shows they're taking a really structured approach to being a responsible company.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about how they use their money, right? How they allocate capital. A big chunk of it goes right back into their main business, especially R&D. In 2024, they spent a whopping $988 million on developing new sequencing technology, expanding their multi-omics capabilities, and just making their manufacturing and commercial stuff better.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, in a field like genomics, you got to keep innovating. It's always changing. And then, we have to talk about their mergers and acquisitions strategy. That's been, big story, let's just say. Their acquisition of GRL, which focuses on early cancer detection, cost them $8 billion. But it ran into huge regulatory roadblocks. And in the end, they had to spin it off in June 2024.
Right.
Illumina kept a minority stake, but that whole thing, it's a tough lesson about regulatory hurdles and also, the challenges of trying to branch out beyond your core expertise.
Definitely a cautionary tale about big acquisitions, especially in a field like this with so much regulation. And, for shareholders, Illumina authorized a new $1.5 billion share repurchase program in August 2024, and they've already bought back over $115 million worth of shares in the second half of the year. They don't pay dividends right now, which honestly, that's pretty typical for a high-growth biotech company. They usually reinvest those earnings to fuel future growth.
Right. Makes sense. Now, we also looked at their return on invested capital. We don't have that specific number for 2024, but their return on equity for the quarter ending December 31st, 2024 was negative 41.93%. It's a pretty striking number, and it's probably tied to that net loss they reported. Yeah, that's not great. It really raises a question about how effectively they're using their capital. Reinvesting is important, sure, but in the long run, it's profitability that really drives value for shareholders.
Totally. Okay, so before we jump into the second half and cover market sentiment, ownership, and risks, we want to tell you about a really cool tool that can help you, get these kinds of insights on your own whenever you need them.
Imagine this. You can generate a full report, like a detailed podcast or even a video analysis on any stock whenever you want.
And what if that analysis was tailored to you? Like, your level of financial knowledge, how deep you want to go in each area.
At stockanalytics.ai, we're not just imagining it, we're building it. We're creating a platform that lets you do all of that. And we're taking it even further. We're adding an interactive interface where you can ask specific questions about the stock, a voice-controlled stock screener to find your next great investment, and even a sophisticated portfolio analyzer that'll help you manage risk and stress test your holdings.
Don't wait. Go to stockanalytics.ai today and check out our demo. You can see the power of this technology firsthand. We've opened up our waiting list for beta users, and early adopters get 50% off. Plus, you might even get a chance to invest in the future of, financial intelligence.
Sign up now at stockanalytics.ai. You don't want to miss this.
Okay, so welcome back. Let's dive into Chapter 4, Market Sentiment. How's the market feeling about Illumina?
Well, it's not looking too good, to be honest. The stock hit a new 52-week low at the end of March 2025, and it's taken a pretty big hit over the past year.
And if you think about everything we've discussed so far, this negativity makes sense, right? They've got the revenue decline, the net loss, and all that uncertainty surrounding the GRL spinoff. People are wondering what the financial impact of that's going to be moving forward. Now, what's interesting is the average one-year target price from analysts is around 138.000. That suggests there might be some upside, from where the stock is trading now. But the analyst recommendations are all over the place, which means while there's no clear consensus about their short-term prospects, some are optimistic, some are not. But what's driving that disagreement? What are the bulls seeing that the bears are missing?
When you see that kind of split among analysts, it usually means there's just a lot of complexity, especially with a company like Illumina. This field, this landscape, it's constantly changing. It's super competitive. Some analysts might be focusing on the long-term potential. Illumina is the market leader. They've got the technology, but others might be more worried about those immediate financial problems and whether their strategic decisions are going to pan out.
Yeah, fair enough. And then there's the news, right? That always impacts things. Back in February 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce put Illumina on their unreliable entity list. That definitely sparked some concern about how much revenue they'll be able to generate in that market, which is huge. Then they had their Q4 2024 results, which actually beat expectations. That might have given things a little boost, at least temporarily, but it wasn't enough to offset the impact of those full-year results, which were still down.
Yeah, the situation in China is a big deal, right? It's potentially a massive market for Illumina, and that unreliable entity designation could make it a lot harder for them to do business there.
For sure. Now, we didn't see specific data on short interest or options activity in the sources we had, but those are definitely things that can give you a better sense of market expectations and potential price swings.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to Chapter 5, ownership structure. A big chunk of Illumina's outstanding shares are owned by institutional investors. We saw names like BlackRock, Capital World Investors, Vanguard, all listed as major holders. And that can be a good thing, because that kind of institutional ownership can bring some stability to the shareholder base.
One thing I noticed, though, we didn't have specific numbers on insider ownership, percentages. And we didn't see any information about recent insider trading activity. That kind of stuff can be important. It gives you a sense of whether the company's management has their interests aligned with those of the shareholders. One thing that is worth noting, though, is the concentration of ownership among those top institutional investors. That means that a big chunk of the company's stock is controlled by just a few entities. And sometimes that can give those large holders a lot of sway when it comes to corporate decisions.
Yeah, good point. And we should also mention corporate governance. Illumina has a board of directors that oversees everything, and Scott Gottlieb was recently appointed as chair. The makeup of that board, who's leading it, that can have a real impact on investor confidence and the direction the company takes.
Okay, so let's wrap up with Chapter 6, risk assessment. We're going to use the SWOT analysis here. So first up, strengths. Illumina is the market leader, no doubt about it. They've got a really comprehensive and innovative product portfolio. That recurring revenue model driven by consumables is a huge plus, and they're seriously committed to R&D. They've got a global presence, and it's not easy to break into this market. There are some pretty high barriers to entry.
But they've got some weaknesses too, right? Like we've talked about, revenue's down. They reported a net loss in 2024. That whole Jerail acquisition and spinoff was costly and messy, and they might be a little too reliant on those core sequencing product lines. Plus, there's that negative return on equity.
And what about opportunities? Well, the genomics market as a whole is growing like crazy. It's a major tailwind for them. And there's more and more demand in areas like personalized medicine, drug discovery, emerging markets, and new applications, like single-cell analysis and epigenetics. Plus, they've got those strategic partnerships, like the ones with SomaLogic and Myriad Genetics, that could really open up some big growth opportunities. And then there's the whole direct-to-consumer genetic testing market. That could be huge for them down the road.
Right, lots of potential there. But of course, there are also threats. They're up against some tough competitors, and there could always be new players entering the market. The regulatory landscape for genomics is constantly shifting, which can create obstacles. Supply chain disruptions are always a risk. And then there are the geopolitical uncertainties, especially with what's going on in China. And they've been involved in some patent disputes, which can be expensive and time-consuming.
So, to quickly sum up this deep dive, Illumina is without a doubt a leader in a really exciting, high-growth industry. They've got strong fundamentals and some clear competitive advantages. But they're definitely dealing with some financial and strategic challenges right now, and investors need to consider those carefully.
Yeah, for you, the listener, especially if you're a value investor, it's all about weighing that long-term potential against those very real concerns that exist right now.
And this brings up an interesting question, something to think about even after we're done here today. Illumina is investing heavily in innovation, and the applications of genomics are expanding rapidly. So what could happen? What are some potential black swan events, both positive and negative, that could completely change the game for Illumina and for the entire healthcare landscape in the next decade? Think big here, not just incremental changes, but truly transformative possibilities.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive into Illumina, we found a company that dominates a truly revolutionary field, but one that's facing some headwinds, both financially and strategically. And I really want you to think about that last point, about the potential for those game-changing events in genomics and what role Illumina might play.
If you enjoyed this analysis, make sure you subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel. We do deep dives like this all the time, looking at companies, market trends, all sorts of insightful financial analysis.
And remember, everyone, this is just for informational purposes. It's not investment advice. Always do your own research. Talk to a qualified financial advisor before you make any investment decisions. And all the sources we use for this deep dive are listed in the episode description, so you can check those out if you want more information.